You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent Fleskens, your host. As always, this week we have a really special discussion to have today. It's one of what I hope is a series of pre-election platform conversations. And the first conversation we are having off the bat is with the leader of the Greens in Western Australia, Brad Pettit. Brad, thanks so much for coming in, mate.
Trent, nice to be here. I'm a regular listener to your show. I find it really thought-provoking and informative, so thank you.
Thanks, mate. I would have to say I have a high level of respect for you. Sometimes have a big disagreement with the platforms of your party, and at the same time, though, I really respect the ability that we have to have very cogent and respectful conversations about, at the end of the day, what both of us want, whether we both agree with all of our platforms or not, and that's just trying to improve the situation of housing in Western Australia, because it is one of our basic needs, isn't it? Housing impacts our ability to access health, mental health as well, but also just food on the table and having a strong job. You can't have any of those things without good housing, right?
Yeah. Now, housing is the fundamental, and all of those things, even kids' education. If your housing system's broken, then everything else starts to unravel. And look, part of the reason I want to come on today is I do think the WA housing system is broken and needs some fundamental reform. And I think we have this opportunity now because it's getting to the point where we can't keep doing what we've been doing and we need to try different things.
I agree with you. That's the first thing I think we do agree on, and it's the one we probably agree on most, is that our housing system is fundamentally broken. We're in a situation where we have all the money in the world, probably one of the richest states in the Western Hemisphere. We have plethora of opportunities in terms of housing supply, more land than most people would ask for that's ready to be developed if it weren't for red tape and a lack of infrastructure. We have a smart housing and construction industry that has unfortunately been withered away by 1,000 cuts of red tape and taxes and some realities around COVID and inflation as well that have made things harder. But most importantly, a very willing industry. And I would have to say, and I'm sure you would agree as well, a willing current government that want to help. But I think we both would agree there's many ideas that are being brought to the table that aren't being listened to that we think would make more of an impact to assist with the impacts that are being made right now from the policies that are working to certain extents.
Yeah. Look, and I think I'm not going to beat up on the government other than to say John Kerry is giving it a good crack now. But to put that in context, and I think something the government wouldn't be willing to admit is they've frankly dropped the ball, at least for the first 4 and probably the first 6 years that they're in power around housing. And you just see that, unfortunately, we're still wearing the consequences of those decisions now. Some really important numbers that your listeners might know came out through the Productivity Commission only about 2 weeks ago, which actually showed, I thought, an amazing statistic, which is that we have less public housing in the middle of 2024 than we did in the middle of 2026. So that's when the government changed. It was actually under Barnett. There was more public housing than there is now. And that's despite John Kerry's talked a lot about building, but they've demolished more than they've built over their term of government.
That's the reality, and I can back that up. I've seen it being on the streets, especially in that first term and a half, as you said. A lot of the public housing was being demolished, and I think a lot of it was ready to be demolished, but it wasn't being rebuilt quick enough. And we certainly weren't using any level of urgency or scale to try and be ready for that problem in what was and would have been the most effective time from a taxpayer's per dwelling to fix this problem. It would have cost 70% less to build all the houses that are being built right now back in 2018, for example.
Absolutely. And when I came to Parliament for the first time in 2021, there was 1,100 less houses then. So they've caught up a little bit. And that's, I think, been the real frustration of many people, just seeing social housing, which looks okay, being demolished and not replaced. In Fremantle, where I am, so for your context for your listeners, I was the mayor of Fremantle for a decade, a bit more, 12 years. And we saw during that time actually pretty close to 1,000 social houses demolished and less than a dozen replaced, which is...
extrapolate that over the rest of the...
And I'm pretty sure Fremantle's not an orphan in that, and yet you see it in other places, and you just think, wow, how do we not work out that we needed to be building while we're demolishing and just not doing one? And that's been a fundamental failure, I think, of this government. I appreciate they're trying to turn that around now, but as you say, they're trying to turn it around at the most constrained, the most expensive time to get things built.
Yeah, and this is where I continue to point out that I actually don't think this has anything to do with John Kerry. I have a lot of respect for John Kerry. I think he's a very hard worker doing as much as he can. This is Ben Wyatt, Mark McGowan and Rita Saffiotti's fault and problem that I believe this has happened in her Overwatch in that time when she was so focused on MetroNet. This is when the best time would have been to have built all these houses, when we would have been employing tradies, employing apprentices, building these things at the cheapest price they relatively would have been built in the last 15 years. Instead, she's focused on one thing, gotten herself the treasury, and then dumped all this on John Kerry. And John is now pushing the proverbials uphill.
Yeah.
And that's a reality. And I think very much he's doing a lot of good things to fix this, but it is in the worst circumstances and the hardest circumstances post-COVID to achieve this.
Very hard. And look, all three treasurers, and I know this on good advice, refused to release the money to get housing built when we could have built it. And that means
why was that? What were they spending it on? Or they just didn't have the money in?
Like in the first term, they were running deficit. So and Ben Wyatt was very good at not spending, but it was also a lost opportunity. We knew we had social housing stock, especially that was in really poor condition, that needed work. And we knew there was a great opportunity then to do that. But you're right. Instead, government focused on a whole bunch of other big infrastructure projects, which were frankly mostly transport, road and rail. I think we spent like 13 billion on MetroNet now and even more on roads. And that, of course, sucked all of the investment when actually a good chunk of that should have gone into housing.
Yeah. And everything's great in hindsight. But I think it's important to delineate the different Labor governments we've seen over the last 8 years, has it been, and the different housing ministers we've had. So let's have a chat about looking forward now, what we can do with the broken system we've got. And I do agree with you, it is broken. When you're in a situation where you're not in control of the amount of people that are coming in that need, in my opinion, 35 to 45,000 homes a year over the last few years. And you, with all levels of intent and trying through the whole industry and even profitability, we could make money doing this. Yeah. We just can't build any more apartments or create any more blocks of land. We're in a broken system when the market is incentivizing supply, but supply can't actually increase anymore to meet demand. So either you have a federal level policy of just close the borders down and stop the amount of people that are coming in, which I don't think everyone entirely agrees with. I think the nuance should be, let's just be smarter about who's coming in, people that can help us, not just people that are piling on the problem. Or you have a Labor Party side where you're incentivizing with a lot of carrots people to be able to move out of Airbnb and subsidy funds to get developers to build more apartments, even though structurally it's still not moving the dial much.
Yep.
And then you've got the Greens platform, which we'll talk about, I think, now, which talks more to the structure of the market and taxes and things like that. Before we get into that, is there any points you would make on those comments?
Yeah. And I think you raise a really important point around, look, I think the Labor Party is talking state now, which is obviously have in the last term done a whole bunch of things which have been aimed at encouraging more housing back into the market. But my criticism on most of those is they've been very much carrots, incentives, and a little bit performative rather than substantive. So take Airbnb as an example. We saw the government, I think it was put almost $3 million towards getting houses out of the short-term market back into the long-term, which got about 280 odd dwellings from memory, which was good, you could say. But during the time they ran that program, over 300 actually went back from the long-term market into the short-term. So actually went backwards while spending $3 million of taxpayers' money.
But we have moved 300 houses into the rental market, which is great, but we haven't disincentivized 340 more people from putting them back into the Airbnb market.
Which will keep doing it.
And the outcome doesn't help.
And it's entirely rational. As someone who owns a second home myself, my partner and I had a really long debate around whether we should Airbnb it or not, because it's the middle of Fremantle, great location.
Bit of money.
You get a lot more. Look, we didn't on principle. We've got a long-term tenant in there. But we know that we would make a lot more doing that. So we need to actually have sticks, which is actually a tax. And interestingly, Airbnb themselves would actually happily cop a 5% tax on short-term rentals, a levy, and we should be doing that, because what that would do is actually, we've got now about 10,000 dwellings that could come back into the long-term market.
Yeah, that would make a big impact on moving the needle.
Exactly. And this is the kind of low-hanging fruit, which government needs to have a bit more courage, frankly, because we've been really timid and just trying to incentivize this stuff rather than actually say, this is a housing crisis, let's actually do some brave things and fix it.
Crisis for a while, Brad. And you're right, crisis is not the word that's being used enough. And I've been trying to push it on this podcast for a few years now, that it is a crisis. Jeremy Cordina, the GM of Parcel, second, third biggest land developer in WA now, pointed out that we have a deficit of 50,000 homes now. So if you were able to arbitrarily move 10,000 Airbnbs back towards long-term rental, which we know we couldn't do all of that. But if you look back 20 years ago when Airbnb didn't exist, there was no alternative but long-term rental. So we have seen this structural move of pulling out supply from this market for no other reason other than a new technology, a new cultural availability of short-term rental Airbnbs that would have otherwise been hotels back in the day, or motels would have been the only option, has made a change to the structure of the supply in our market that we haven't been able to catch up on with providing new supply. So the alternative you do with, for example, cigarettes or sugar is you tax people away from supplying those things, or at least demanding those things.
Yep, and it works. And we can use the market, and I think that the market works very effectively, but with the right price incentives in the market, you get the outcomes you want. And I think that's where government's been very timid around putting the right price incentives in place to shift the market in the way we want it to go.
Now, look, I'm a free market guy. I'm a big capitalist, obviously, but this is one of those things where I would agree. I was a bit bemused and befuddled by that policy. No one was asking for an Airbnb incentive.
Yep.
It just came out and everyone's going, oh, that's an interesting one. We would have all been pretty happy with a tax, to be honest. That would have been rational.
Yep.
So the incentive, I think, why not? Keep the incentive if you want to spend it, but also bring in the stick that makes sure that we're not bringing back 300 and losing 340 within the same time.
I actually moved a motion to Parliament. We actually had a budget neutral approach, which was literally using the tax to fund the incentive. And actually between those two, I reckon you could get a really big shift in that market.
And I think that's the whole point of things like sugar tax or cigarette tax. If you're going to create structural issues in this economy, Airbnb, in the same way that cigarettes cause issues for our health system, let's use the tax to fund the beds.
Yep,
okay?
you're right.
All right, let's talk about the green stuff. And this is where we're going to get a bit entertaining, I think, because I'm going to start pushing you on some of your platforms, or at least the Greens platforms. The first one, and I think the one that I think is by far the most idiotic, I just don't understand how the Greens can have had anyone with any economic background sign this off, is capping rent increases. We know, Brad, that just basic year 10 economics, you cap the upside of any investment, supply goes down. Demand staying constant, this is not affecting demand. If demand stays constant, and you cap the incentive for supply, you limit supply. So when you have limited supply and demand just stays constant, let alone going up, which it is right now, then price goes up, right? So what you're doing there is you're going to structurally, in my opinion, reduce the amount of rentals, private rentals, which I think is like 98% of our market in the first place. Those people who rent can't afford or don't have a lifestyle for buying, so you can't argue they're just going to become an owner-occupied property straight away. The new supply just falls out the market, and we've seen it in some states around Australia where it's exacerbated the problem. What's going on with the headspace here of capping rent increases? Why does the Greens think it's actually going to work structurally and not just for their constituent of young people who are obviously renting?
Well, can I say that you're making out that constituent is a small one? It's 1/3 of people rent now. In Western Australia, 700,000 people rent.
Yep.
And frankly, a lot of those people are going to be renting for the rest of their life because lots of the young people cannot afford to buy a house anymore. Where the Greens are coming from around a rent cap, in this case, used a model which I quite like, which was from the ACT. So the ACT has a simple premise where the cap, though, is CPI plus 10%. So 3, you can put up your rent 3.3. But you can also appeal to go higher if there's good reason. For example, you put a new bathroom in or you put a new bedroom on, there's good reason why you could up your rent more than that. But you go to a panel and that's done.
Sounds like a lot of red tape.
Potentially. The other choice, though, is where we are now, where we've seen in Western Australia rents go up. I think it's almost 50%. The number I've got in front of me says 38.6 since December 19, but I understand since COVID, we've seen almost a 50% rent increase, which is literally just saying lots of people cannot afford to rent anymore.
Of course it is, yeah. That tracks with the growth in the median house price.
Yes, that's right. So we've seen
everyone's
paying more, but except for the people who aren't paying more are those who've already paid off their rental property. And
of course,
yeah,
that's a huge structural change.
So the Greens come up from a very different position, and this is probably the fundamental disagreement we have: is that we see housing as a human right, not just as something that is a commodity that is open to the market. So if housing, and as we started our conversation, is the fundamental of good society, if you've got to get, and the idea then that rents can just jump all over the place, and that people can be forced into homelessness because they can't afford their rent, I think is a real problem. We need to stop these extreme fluctuations. I think it's got so out of control now that I think the market, frankly, and I think the Greens are putting forward a solution that says, let's look at a cap. In fact, my East Coast colleagues have gone further and actually talking about a freeze.
Yeah,
and
it's mental.
It's
really tough to stand by.
But it's a strong response to a catastrophic situation. And I guess I would pivot to say, if the industry doesn't like that, other than supply, which might fix this problem in 5 or 10 years' time, what is the solution? Because we cannot have this idea that people are forced into homelessness because their rents, no fault of their own, are going through the roof.
I agree with you, and I don't think it's a short-term solution, right? At the end of the day, this is a structural solution, as we both agreed. But The first point I would make is I'd say one of the most successful countries in the world, economically, living standards, is Switzerland. My wife's Swiss. I know a lot about this country these days. 60% of the people that live there rent. Most of these people are very well-to-do. It's funny how our culture nearly connects our self-worth with our ownership, right? Whereas many places around the world, it's not even a conversation. They don't even have a property pod because it's not interesting, right? It's interesting. That's an interesting point. But to go back to debating this issue of a rent cap, if you were to accept the basic economics that it will affect supply long term, what happens is you're in a situation where you're in this free market anyway. We're not going to suddenly turn socialist or communist in the future. So we have to accept that we are in this capitalist free market and it has its downsides. And my opinion about how good effective governments should act, whether they're left or right or in between, is that they should be facilitating to the best extent they can a free market. But when you have free markets, you always have winners and losers, people who have more of a proclivity to be able to win and lose in this free market. So the government of the day should be facilitating the free market, but always using their tax money to protect those who are always going to lose from the free market. And in our situation, that's social housing. So what happens is if you're going to have a policy where you are going to limit the future incentive for more from private rentals, which is where 8% of our rentals come from, you then need to increase the capacity and the intent and the delivery from the state government, which makes it start to become more of a socialist outcome, right? No surprises. To fill the gap, to make sure you're minimizing homelessness. What's happening is you're creating a situation where the need for social housing increases because the supply of free market housing is being constrained over time by lack of incentive. Now, you might say that's what we want. I would argue that the government currently is failing massively, backtracking on that. And generally, governments are far less efficient from a money perspective at doing anything. And so it's just going to lead to eventually more and more taxpayer dollars going towards housing more and more people at what you would suggest should be subsidized rental payments, which then would constrict the amount of money being able to be spent for health, education, other things the government should be spending. I know that's a long-winded explanation or rebuttal on this, what is a socialist measure, right? But don't you think it just creates more socialist requirements?
It does. You're right. It does put the onus back on government to build more social housing.
Because someone has to house people who lose.
And that's actually our policy. That so in WA, we announced this at the recent housing forum, is that we want government to building 5,000 new social homes a year.
Is that enough?
That if we do it in perpetuity, yes, it is. And it means we can catch up. So the percentage of social housing actually used to be something like percent in this state. We're now at 3.7. We have literally let, over decades, social housing decline and decline.
It's been palmed off to the private market because no one else was going to do it. And therefore, with incentives,
because Gov vacated the space.
Right.
And
so who's going to fill it?
So government needs to get back in the space, is my point. We did an okay job of that. I live in an old social housing house in White Gum Valley, which is still great. But what I would say is, so we need to see government building a lot more so that also, then social housing isn't just the last net. And that net, frankly, isn't working. The wait list for, it's just applications, not people, is over 20,000 applications now.
It's mental.
It's over 40,000 people. You'll be on that wait list for years. So when you are forced out with high rent, it's not like you can go into social housing. You go on the street or you go into your car because the social housing wait list is that long and that broken.
It is broken as well. And that's just where I guess the argument comes back to you, Brad, is I agree we need far more social housing just with the free market we have right now, even if you don't make it more socialist, which is what the Greens are asking to do, right? With the system we have right now, we aren't even supplying the social housing we need. And the social housing we have is the least efficient. When you think about a private landlord, they get a tenant leave. They're straight in within a week getting it renovated if it's been trashed, right? The amount of houses that I drive past just on the same street as my grandma that are left for periods of 6 months to a year between every social housing client that comes in is phenomenal. The wastage is insane. Yeah. So why would we want to leave that with government agencies that are acting as C graders in terms of their outcomes? I'm talking
I'm going to agree with you again and surprise you.
Yeah. Market is most efficient when it is in a free market capitalist state. And yes, it's more greedy because it's incentivized by greed, but at least there's incentive to perform. Whereas when you have socialist outcomes by the government, there's no incentive. They just leave skip bins at the front of places for 6 months because they can't get a trade-in because they're not incentivized to actually move the needle.
But between the private and public housing, there are other options as well. And this is where I think some of the solutions lay that we need to get better at and do it.
Tell me.
So community housing is one. So the community housing sector.
Explain what the community housing sector is.
So the difference with the community housing sector still has subsidized housing, but so it's rental housing, but managed by a community organization rather than the government. Now, the reason that's important is that, frankly, they're better at government at doing it. They have much better turnaround times.
So it's like a NGO where it's a private company,
it's not for profit, not this giant government department.
People sitting in Department of Housing.
They frankly just literally leave houses vacant for... Now, that's really important because now there's some key things about that is government has this weird policy where for social housing, they literally just pick the next person on the list. Whether that person is a good fit in that community and that complex is the next person on the list. Community housing actually has a much more nuance. They can actually work out which is the right mix of people together. This is an older people kind of spot. And so the track record of those places is actually, they work. It doesn't become that ghetto that often is associated with social housing. So community housing is one. And
how do we make community housing more prevalent, though? There's not that many people in Perth who want to quit their day job making a few $100,000 a year as a development manager for a big company to then go and run a not-for-profit and do good for the world in a totally altruistic way. Let's just be honest.
Yeah, that's true.
How many people want to run non-for-profit?
But on the East Coast, we're seeing it actually grow quite quickly because what government's doing is realising how much better they are at it. They're actually transferring a lot of the old social housing into the community housing sector, getting them to manage it, and these are big organisations with, I suspect, very well-paid staff.
So they get, you're saying that are better. The staff are better in a non-for-profit than in a government.
I've worked in government departments. There's something weirdly risk-averse around the way government works.
Because the whole government system, I think you come in there wanting to make a difference. You get ground down year after year that you can't make decisions. You have no autonomy and your KPIs are essentially to not stuff up. And when you're making decisions, taking small risks, sometimes you do stuff up. But in private sectors, you get applauded for that.
Spot on. Yep. And we need more of that. And I'm a big fan of actually working with, I think we need to work with the private sector, with the community sector. And there's still a role for the public sector, but I think we need to get a more diverse mix. And WA is interesting in we're the only state that hasn't transferred substantial amounts of public housing into the community sector over the last decade.
That's interesting.
And the minister really got quite angry at the Housing Forum the other day when the sector was asking for that.
Okay. So you think 5,000 homes a year. I agree that regardless of whether they're efficient or not, there is always a role for government to provide social housing. And I think the biggest policy I would have, which is supply-based, and it comes around again, is that regardless of whether we're a capitalist service or a socialist sort of market, in terms of the way we lean, at least in this world, the government has a responsibility and should never shirk its responsibility and should never have shirked its responsibility years ago, which is why we're in this situation, to continually support the supply of new social housing like it had since World War II, which is still, as you said, effective today in our new land estates especially, and that through, for example, Housing Authority owns a bunch of land, not building anything, minimal amounts compared to what the land they've got, right? So much so that they had a housing diversity pipeline to essentially say, hey, private sector, we can't do it. We don't have enough people or resources or whatever it is. We're going to sell you our land so that you guys can do it. Now, again, that's actually a pretty good idea because it means we'll get it done more efficiently, but it just shows there's not enough capacity in the system.
How many of those projects actually?
None of them have been allocated yet.
It's been the most painful. Literally, it
is a very painful project.
Can we just get on and do this? I mean,
it is a painful project. I'm a proponent of a couple of applications where I think we can make a difference that's strategic, and it's taking a while. It's not taking too long right now. It's just going through its process, but there's a couple of guys assessing 50 applications, so it's going to take a while, and then it will take a few years before we can get it all sorted. But still, that would have been more cost effective and efficient than the government do it. But still, there needs to be, because to the legislator, I think this has been my biggest policy if I was going into government, get rid of the rent caps and all the other things that everyone wants to do. Just like a mandated amount, a minimum amount of 5,000 to 10,000 homes every year. And it's going to do two things. One, it's going to help with the supply issue, more than two things. Two, therefore, it's going to help with housing cost, median house price issue because you won't be undersupplied every year. And three, we're going to maintain this fundamental foundational ballast support for training young tradies, apprentices, so they don't end up going to the mines.
Exactly right. And look, I agree with you on that. Actually, realizing this comes back to housing is a human right. We need a workforce and we need an industry that can support that.
That's a big problem. We don't have the industry anymore. We've essentially shunned the industry away from the housing market in the last downturn and moved them all back to where they came from, whether it's in New Zealand or Ireland or England or wherever it was. Said, we don't have any work for you, sorry. Or up to the mines, and they never come back when they go to the mines. Okay, so that's that one. What about the next platform? I don't know how you do this. I'd be really impressed if you do. Regulate the banks to deliver lower mortgages. How do you make them do that?
Okay. So that's a federal policy, one which I never quite understood myself. I'll be upfront with you about that. Where that flowed from is my federal counterparts thought if you're going to cap rents, you don't want to throw the mortgagees under a bus, so then you need to cap mortgages. Like, I think, this is where
they're trying to meet the counter argument as which, well, hang on a second, if you're going to cap rents, what about our downside risk?
Yeah, so certainly not a green WA policy, and one that I would personally push back against, because I think you end up in this kind of weird space then of trying to overly intervene in the economy. You'd end up with unintended inflationary consequences. I've certainly said this to my federal colleagues. They won't be surprised to hear me say it again. So certainly I'm pleased that didn't go anywhere. I think
it's going to, where you could try it or not. We'd all like lower mortgages, but regulating that is I guess the four pillars of our economy is the four banks. Good luck. The next one, scrapping tax handouts to wealthy property investors with more than 2 properties. So that includes negative gearing. So I guess the way you're trying to nuance this from reading it on face value is to say, hey, yeah, Australian mum and dads have a right to have an investment property.
Yeah.
Let's call it one. But if you're going to have more than that, you're getting greedy and we're going to tax you or not give you handouts on the second and third one because that's more than you need. Is that essentially the point?
Basically that's right. Negative gearing has undoubtedly been I'm a beneficiary of it. It's a great tax write-off. I guess the question is the amount of tax foregone, things we want to invest in hospitals and schools, so people can own dozens of houses, I think was never the intent. I do think we need to constrain that. And this is actually a way also, and this is a bold policy I've pitched to my party, but never actually, not one we're announcing, but I think is a really tough conversation we need to have in our community that says we want to actually keep property prices pretty much at CPI.
Manageable.
We do not want to see property growth continue.
Otherwise, you end up like a Hong Kong.
Yeah, and this is probably something that is a hard conversation for us to have, but we need to have it to say that house prices have got so extreme now. We need to put a brake on that and get that as close to CPI as we can, because without that, my kid or all our kids will never be on their own afford a house, and that's not the kind of society we want to live in.
Do you think that as a society we're too self-interested and conflicted to actually be honest about that? To say, hey, yeah, look, on the face of it, we don't want our kids and grandkids to be priced out. But I just made 200 grand last year, Brad. Right. I don't know if I'm going to vote again.
That John Howard line always rings in my head. He said to a journalist in the mid 2000s, "I've never had someone come up to me in a shopping mall and complain that the house prices went up." And so it's just hard for politicians. And
we saw Bill Shorten have a crack, and I don't know about you, but I would have thought Bill Shorten was a shoo-in to get Prime Minister back in 2018, leading into 2019, and then he shot himself in the foot by getting essentially hubris, thinking he was a shoo-in himself, and then going, you know what, I'm going to run on killing superannuation, killing negative gearing, and killing capital gains tax discounts. You could have just kept your mouth shut and you would have elected, mate.
Yeah. He could have. And look, and I admired his ambition, but you're right, the politics of it are tough. But I always go back, and I think this is a statement of fact. We should have never had both a capital gains discount and negative gearing. One of those, I think you can get a pretty good housing market. Add two of those together, and all you're doing is pushing up prices.
Well, yeah.
And that's what we've seen.
It's super incentivized landlords to get into the market to the extent they have the competency and the financial capacity to do. And again, we're talking about 1 or 2% of people have more than, I'm pretty sure it's something really small. I have to fact check myself there, but it's a really immaterial number of people, right? So you're taxing more on the value system of it rather than real outcomes. It's not millions or hundreds of thousands of people that are the perpetrators of this. But I don't think many people would disagree with saying, look, after a certain amount of houses, you can't have that much. There's already been structurally disincentivized and landlordship for a while now by really tightening up on a lot of tax incentives or at least tax expenses. We've spoken about that on this podcast with Carlo Bordi many times. But I think, again, if you're going to have a platform where you're going to reduce the incentive for new supply of rentals, which is a foundation of our market, then you need to have an answer for filling the gap with the government because no one else is going to do it. And that's where I think it's about figuring out how many new rentals do we think we're not going to get because people walk away. And they already have been walking away just from the updates to the current Rental Tenancies Act that have essentially said people are allowed to paint their walls and have a dog. So you think about if they actually start minimizing.
But where do those houses go? Because we thought they didn't go far enough. The Greens are pushing pretty hard.
Of course you would, Ben. Yeah.
Because now we're the only state where you can do no cause evictions. And we were pushing pretty hard to say.
So where do they go? My opinion is this. Some of them go back into the rental market again with other investors who go, oh, I'll have it anyway. That'd be one. Two, it would be sold into the private ownership market, second, third homeowners, or even first homeowners. So you get some wins out of that. Whether they were renters before or not is the question. But more importantly, it's not about the current homes that are in this market, in this pool. It's about disincentivizing the new homes we need because it's about the 50,000 house deficit we have and the reality that 98% of the 30% that would be investment properties are being disincentivized to participate in that, right? If you're going to do that, the state government has to step up and supply that gap or you lead to homelessness. There is no alternative but homelessness, which is worse for everyone, homeless and non-homeless. None of us want to see homeless people walking around the streets, let alone be homeless. That's a big issue with that policy is you have to price in, you have to do the economics on what you're going to have to pick up the ball on and then pay for it and then do it.
That's right. Look, I think, and again, it's not just government building houses. I think there's a whole bunch of really interesting models that we've seen from overseas. We talked a bit before about modular, around how do we really ramp that up, because I think that's going to be really interesting. But also,
we spoke about modular on the podcast last week.
Yeah, which was,
you were in the Netherlands actually going and doing your own tour about modular over there.
Yes.
Tell me an anecdote that you've told me off air that I find really interesting. A lot of people would too.
Yeah. When I was in the Netherlands, I met up with some business people there who are doing some work. In fact, one of them actually does some work both in Australia and here. And we did a tour of some factories. And these factories are literally giant assembly lines, highly efficient, producing really high quality housing, like at the highest sustainability kind of energy efficiency ratings you could imagine.
Paint a picture for me for a sec. How big is this
Oh, these
facility?
are giant factories.
The size of Malaga markets?
Yeah,
Way bigger than that?
Yeah, like multi-hectares, like where trucks drive.
Like an industrial estate?
Yes, huge factories. And in fact, they were just finishing one which wasn't quite operating when I was there, which was literally, it just ran on a giant assembly line, on a giant conveyor belt. And everyone did these different bits, including robots building these houses.
It was like a car assembly line.
It's like imagine like a giant car assembly line, but with housing, and wood comes in one end, actually wood and insulation comes in one end, and a house comes out the other.
Cool.
It would take 3 or 4 days for a house to go through this assembly line. So you actually, wood comes in, 3 or 4 days later, a house comes out the other end. And at a price which they assured me was cheaper than a standard build in the Netherlands. Now, the way that this got up, which I think was really interesting, is that this company built with no financial input from the Netherlands government. All they got was they said that they agreed that they would purchase several hundred homes a year.
Guaranteed demand.
Guaranteed demand. And the person who took me on this tour wants to do something similar here in Australia, because they said, we would do this, but we need government to agree that they would buy X number over a number of years so that it's worth us investing in this factory. And we would
What's
guarantee...
the response been?
Apparently, what I've been told is that there'd be no response from the minister or the department. So this is my frustration, is we have great ideas, people wanting to invest and actually fundamentally change our housing market, and they can't even get a meeting with the minister to talk about this.
This talks to the podcast we had last week, in that I'm touring a facility that's on a couple of hectares in Malaga. It was Fox Modular, and they're doing some great things. They're full, but the cost model doesn't compete with a double brick home right now. And therefore, you're not going to be able to get consumers to want to go and spend the extra, whatever it is, 20, 30, 50% on these houses compared to a double brick home with your local project builder. Structurally, you have to offer a price incentive to get people to move from the thing they're used to that is the least risky outcome, which is double brick, unfortunately, in Perth. We don't have the scale, obviously, or any sort of tax subsidy system. Again, if you're going to tax sort of things, this is where you'd be spending the subsidies in building another conveyor belt system for new housing that could be the social housing of 5,000 homes a year. At the end of the day, if you're in social housing, you're not complaining whether it's timber or it's some vulcanized foam or it's double brick or whatever it is, as long as it's safe.
Oh, and these houses were beautiful, because I got to walk through the finished ones at the end of the assembly line. They were great. And there's some extraordinary videos of them going on site. Some of them were 3 stories, and they literally...
Terrace housing.
Yeah, terrace housing. And it was quite common, one of the most common ways. And I think these are some of the opportunities that it hasn't realised yet, because frankly, our double brick homes aren't the most energy efficient, energy intensive to build, and we've got to get smarter and better. And I think these are some of the opportunities that we're not grabbing yet.
Well, I think we need to get quicker as well. And obviously, COVID has a lot to do with it. None of us can control that, has been able to. But I think one thing that has had a huge thing to do with it has been the lack of labour available. And Metronet has really exacerbated that problem. It's made the cost of building that much more expensive because all the traders are getting paid more. Surprise, surprise, that's a labour outcome. Traders getting paid more, whether you like it or not. But also, it's just made it that much slower. You see this huge lead time right now between the massive amount of commencements in houses a few years ago, and still we haven't actually seen that bubble of commencements come through as completion, still 3 years later. And so we aren't seeing the effect of it because we don't have the people. And we're importing, and the state government can't control this, 90,000 people a year. Most of them aren't helping the industry. They're doing things that aren't helpful to our industry, right? It just makes no sense to me that, and I would have thought this would be a great Greens policy. If we're going to bring the people in, make sure we know what they're good at and that they can help.
Look, I can't argue with you. Absolutely right. And this is, you think it should be good, just fundamental government policy around these are the people we need to provide the foundation, which is the housing, for
everything else.
Absolutely right.
The education, the health, all those sort of things. Are there any other policies that you wanted to talk to, especially from a West Australian perspective?
Yeah, look, so I guess there are a couple of other elements to this. One is the amount we're building. I think there are other fundamental bits is where are we building it? And one of the things that we're and I've been pushing very hard on, is let's actually get some good planning in place to do density around train stations. So when's the last time we did a transit-orientated development that in this? Subiaco probably is, frankly, Richard Court. It's just extraordinary. Even remember when he was Premier, it was 25 years ago. It was the last time we actually initiated a transit-orientated development in this state. And
so you're talking about Subi Central?
Yep, that's the last one.
The ironic thing about Subi Central is there's not a person in Perth these days who would say that was...
Oh, exactly. It was totally underdone. In fact, it's only when you get to the edge of it that it gets a bit denser and it gets a bit better. It's actually literally under baked. But imagine, and local governments have a good right to be frustrated here. Take North Fremantle, where around that train station or even a bit further up the line. Imagine doing really high density integrated train station with apartments above it, views of the ocean. It could work. The government owns most of this land, as does Andrew Forrest and a couple of superannuation firms, all itching to go, but just government dragging their feet. And you just think, where is
government or is it local government way?
No, it's state government. Local governments. I was the mayor pushing for it. The new mayor, Hannah Fitzharding, is also pushing for it. And we have this WAPC moving very slowly with main roads and other government agencies, and everyone else is getting frustrated saying we could and should be doing something amazing, because we're not talking enough about density and actually how do we go from 70% on the fringe, what we're doing now, which is fundamentally crime, to actually getting at least half of our new dwellings in the urban core.
I agree. There's a white paper that's been sitting in the state government since 20 or 15 years ago now that says we want 47% of our new dwellings to come from infill, and it's a fraction of that at the moment, and that's only because of the reality that it's multiples harder to do infill right now because the cost structure just doesn't work. Yeah. And the medium density code, for example, made it that much more expensive to do even medium density, and that all you've got left is what's always been pretty easy to do without that much public outcry, because there's not that many neighbours and not that many people to be concerned about it, is urban expansion. So what happens is every time there's a supply issue, you get the big guys like Satterley and Pettitt and Stockland tap on the shoulder of Kerry and go, mate, we can fix this for you. Gives an approval. And he goes, oh, thanks. Thank you very much. And now at least we've got our numbers. We've got this many approved. But actually the reality is we haven't had more than 1,000 and a bit apartments completed in Douay for years, which is
going to be 600 and something this year.
Yeah, it needs to be 15,000 a year.
Yeah, that's right.
So how are we doing that? And the issue is we have now, because the arse has been ripped out of this industry over the last 5 years, there isn't even a build. There's developers who have got DAs, Brad, there's plenty of them. But the issue is most of them still don't stack up. Some do, but most don't. And even if they did, there's hardly a builder in Perth that would want to or could or has even the experience now, because most of them have gone broke or left, to build these things. So how do we fix that? Do we just need the state to step up and spend way more than anyone else will to start building an industry again?
We do. We absolutely fundamentally need to look. It's been so depressing watching so many good builders go under, but we need now to reinvest in that sector, because if we're serious about actually meeting our density targets, not making the longest city in the world even longer, but actually creating a livable city, we need to get in the front foot on this. We need government to lead and to plan. At the moment, the only density we're getting is frankly ad hoc. It's a Blackburns of the world.
Developer-led.
Yeah, developer-led, which is ad hoc, because they will choose projects which work. And they're good. I'm not saying they're not good projects. They are good projects, but they're not always in the right location. They're in these kind of slightly odd locations, not necessarily near transit.
They're working with the land in Globo, if you want to call it land they can find.
Exactly right.
It's the old supermarkets for Blackburn. It's the old Amana Living. It's big industrial sites that are being reconverted to residential. As you said, it is really ad hoc and it's rats and mice. That's the hard thing about urban infill, is it's always going to be rats and mice unless we have broad scale rezonings that say, hey, there's massive upzoning in this particular area that makes sense for you to go and buy these 10 houses, because that's what it would take.
True. But also there's our activity centres, your Fremantles, your Midlands.
Canyon Bridge precinct's been a great example of it.
Yeah. And that's actually probably been one of the only precincts that's worked. And I think that there's a variable quality there. But we actually want people in our old centres, because as a mayor of Fremantle, I was always frustrated. We knew the answer to every one of Fremantle's problems.
People.
Was people. And look,
there was a decade there where it was a ghost town.
Look. And
it's still a bit of a...
It still needs twice the amount of people that are there. So when I was mayor, there was 100 people living downtown when I became mayor. There's now about 2,000. We need 7. So we've got a long way to go.
And it scares me, Brad, that we don't really, not even myself really, like I've got ideas, but unless the state government is going to sponsor this structurally in terms of making losses, maybe that's the point, I don't know.
But there's a role.
How else are we going to do this? Because as a massive free market capitalist, there is no answer to most of this in Bayswater train station, which has just been upgraded, in Henrybrook train station, Ellenbrook train station, Canning Vale, Ranford Road, none of these could remotely come close to being feasible from a break-even point of view, let alone profitable. So how can the government sit there and pass the pub test with the taxpayers to go, yeah, we're building apartments, but we're going to be losing a bucket load of money doing this, even if we're selling to the public at the end of the day?
Let's take Bayswater as an example. Really
great centre, great opportunity.
Should be one of the busiest train stations in the metro area now. State government owns a huge parcel of land there. Development WA owns a huge parcel of land, ready to go, no movement. If they're not going to do it themselves, why aren't they going out to the sector to say, we will give you this land at no cost to get this project, to get this going?
You know what it needs to be, though? It needs to be no cost. It needs to be no headworks. It needs to be, we'll pay your payroll tax. That's gone as well. It needs to be that many incentives. And you know what? We can look at each other and go, yeah, just do that.
Do it.
Yeah.
Because there's no cost to government. You're not getting those things anyway because nothing's happening.
Exactly.
There's actually no real... And
every house that gets, every apartment, here's another one, every apartment that gets sold, no matter what the cost, stamp duty free for the buyers.
I reckon if it's within 800 metres of a train station, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, doesn't matter. Even if it's a $5 million apartment, it doesn't matter.
Let's just target and get density happening, and we need to incentivize it. And this is where government needs to get back in the driver's seat. Frankly, they've been just letting the market run, and there's a really important role for government to actually start to get our planning back in our city. We want to get the people where we want them, and actually start to turn around what frankly is a runaway train of sprawl and pretty crappy development on the fringe.
Yeah. Look, Brad, I think the great thing about this conversation is as much as we have some very obvious disagreements on things like rent capping and the structural outcomes of that, we have a lot more in common, I think, in terms of how we want to fix this issue, in terms of urban infill, in terms of state-sponsored supply. We can't make it work from a free market perspective, given how knackered the structure of it is in the first place. I think there's a lot more we have in common after this conversation than we thought at the start, which is great, right?
Which is true.
And the point is, we just want the best outcome for our state.
That's right. And I hope what it shows is that if you're looking at the issues and what needs to happen, then actually the solutions present themselves. But these solutions require courage, and that's the bit that's missing at the moment. And governments probably need to get a bit braver and a bit more bold, especially government that's got as much surplus as us.
Exactly. No, the disappointing part of it is, if there was ever a time where a government could just do what they want, it was the last 4 years, because they had both houses. Absolutely. They had really no one to debate them except for you. This was a chance where you could have these brave policies, piss some people off, but get stuff actually done, right? That wasn't just a train line. Handfuls of people are using it.
Yes. And this is the real danger of metro. I caught the train out to Ellenbrook yesterday. Actually, I did a tour of Ellenbrook yesterday with Mike Day, who you know from Roberts Day. To look at how do you do suburbia well, which was fascinating. But I got the train back and I was like, each of those train stations, literally there's no density coming anywhere near those train stations in my lifetime.
No, because it doesn't work. If it doesn't work in bloody Fremantle for the most part, it's definitely not working in Henley Brook. Yeah. Okay, so at the end of the day, I think what we've learned is that if we do deliver the supply, and especially in the right spaces, whether it's profitable or not, as a government, we don't actually need to do the rent capping, do we? Because
it will sort itself out. And look, and rent capping is always, it's an emergency measure in a broken market. This is where we're going to agree again. Once we fix the market, we don't need it.
What a fantastic chat, Brad. I really appreciate the conversation and the honesty and the humility as well about all of this. You are one of my favorite politicians, despite the fact you are a Green. At the end of the day, I think we do agree on a lot of this. So good luck with the election. You're a good guy. You do a lot for your community, and I think it's pretty obvious you'll get re-elected again. Thanks, mate.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!